Would you just briefly introduce yourself, please?
Sure. My name is Kharis Templeman. I'm the program manager of the Taiwan Democracy and Security Project at Stanford University. And I'm here in Taiwan on a short research trip.
A lot of people are talking about the relationship USA, China, Taiwan right now. Some people say there's a fundamental shift happening or about to happen. What do you think about that?
So in the trilateral relationship, historically the United States has been the force for stability. And when there have been shifts in the relationship, it has either come from Taiwan or from the People's Republic of China. We're in an unusual situation right now in that the American side is actually the most unpredictable. And I think, in fact, we are seeing a pretty significant shift in U.S. views of and policy towards the People's Republic of China.
And how does Taiwan factor into that?
Yeah, so, well, let me just talk about the shift a little bit. Up until about 5 years ago, there was still a large contingent of people in the American foreign policy community, certainly within the State Department, within the National Security Council, and other elements of the Washington foreign policy establishment that viewed China in optimistic terms, that thought, if you squint hard, you can see some signs of reform, some liberalization, a move to give market forces a greater role in the economy, a move to give more space to civil society organizations, and so forth. And since Xi Jinping took office, it's really, really hard to make that case anymore. And so there's really been a sea change in views towards China in the Washington community, to the point where people are much more pessimistic about China's near to midterm future, I think.
And you're saying, so it's not only Donald Trump who's doing things differently, because that's how European news often reported, and everything that happens is all because Trump does something erratically. But you say it's like a larger shift in thinking.
Absolutely, yeah. This is a bipartisan shift, so both Democrats and Republicans are much more negative than they used to be, and it's deep. In particular, the American business community used to be the main force for stability and closer relations between the U.S. and China. And the business community, frankly, has promise fatigue. They're tired of dealing with the hassles of doing business in China, and so they're no longer a strong lobbying force in favor of closer ties. And some of them are quietly supporting what the Trump administration is doing right now in its relationship with China. And so even if, say, Hillary Clinton had won the last election, I think you would still see this shift toward a harder, more confrontational line towards China.
So that means that it's not only like political, geostrategic, military considerations, like China trying to establish itself as the predominant power in the region, South China Sea, all that. You're saying pressures also come from the business community. What are they worried about?
Yeah, well, the business community is first and foremost worried about making money. That's why they exist. And it's become increasingly difficult for them to operate in China, to run a business there, to return profits to their shareholders. And there are whole industries, and particularly the social media and technology industries, that really cannot operate in China today because of the barriers that the Chinese have put up. The flip side of that is that Chinese companies can operate freely in the United States, and so there's a sense that the playing field is not fair at all. There's no reciprocity. And so on that front, I don't think this gets enough coverage, but the business community is really unhappy as a whole with the opportunities that are available in China today. And if we talk about other dimensions too, so in education, for instance, a lot of American universities actually looked to establish partnerships with Chinese universities over the last, say, 15 years. These days, that is looking like a less and less appealing option to many universities because of all the problems with control over curriculums, in enforcement of censorship laws and so forth. And so even among civil society sectors, it's become more and more difficult to operate in China as well. And that we haven't even touched on security and military issues. And there as well, I think The Pentagon has always been kind of the most hawkish part of the U.S. government in its views towards China, but the fact that the South China Sea, that China has attempted to, and in fact succeeded in occupying land features in the South China Sea and turning them into military bases, that is now publicly known. It's very widely known. The pictures that were published in the New York Times and in the Center for Strategic and International Security have really driven home just how dramatic and massive a change the Chinese have implemented in the South China Sea. And it's a clear violation of a pledge that Xi Jinping made to Obama not to militarize the South China Sea. And so there's a fundamental shift, I think, among people who were previously optimistic about China across a wide array of sectors that goes way, way beyond Donald Trump.
You talked about U.S.-China relationship. So Taiwan in this whole relationship has been ignored for a long time, or they've been standing at the sidelines, watching, not really being mentioned so much. What has happened concerning Taiwan now?
Well, U.S. policy towards Taiwan has traditionally, really since the late 70s when they switched diplomatic recognitions to the PRC, has been dominated by concerns about the U.S.-China relationship. And occasionally, there will be an administration or members of Congress who take a special interest in Taiwan and proactively try to influence Taiwan policy in a way that benefits Taiwan. But mostly, the U.S. interest is in having Taiwan not interfere in the broader relationship. And that was certainly the case under the Obama administration. The better cross-strait relations got, the less of a pain the Taiwan issue was to the broader U.S.-China relationship, the better. And the Obama administration was happy to let that be.
That's why even though Obama and Clinton instituted the pivot to Asia policy, they didn't really ever mention Taiwan at all in that context, right?
That's right, yeah. Taiwan, from that perspective, was too much trouble to have it involved in the pivot. And they also didn't want the pivot to be interpreted as an anti-China vehicle or an anti-China coalition, even though in large part it was, I think. So Taiwan really, under the Obama administration, did not play a large role in U.S. Pacific Asian foreign policy or military security policy at all.
So will we hear more about Taiwan in the international news now, and why?
I think so, yeah. Partly because a corollary to be taking a harder line against the People's Republic of China is that policymakers in Washington, D.C. tend to support Taiwan more. But a second feature is especially in the Trump administration, personnel really is policy. And the people who are being appointed to key decision-making positions now are, I think, true believers in the value of Taiwan's existence as an independent entity and are admirers of its democratic political system, of its economy, of its vibrant civil society, and so view Taiwan as something to be valued for its own sake rather than as just a piece of the larger U.S.-China relationship. And so I think we will see a kind of proactive move towards strengthening the U.S.-Taiwan relationship.
But now you mentioned like value-based relationship. But before you talked about geostrategic military considerations and business. So sounds a little bit like Taiwan will always be the pawn, like in between the two big powers here.
Yeah, well, from a U.S. perspective, Taiwan is important to Americans for a couple of reasons. One is as a symbol of our broader commitment to the stability of the Asia-Pacific region. If we were to break off our de facto support for Taiwan, that would send a very chilling signal to all of our other allies and partners in the region. Second, Taiwan actually is an important economy in the region. It's a critical part of production chains that stretch from mainland China all the way to the United States, and in some cases start in Silicon Valley. And so anything that would threaten those chains threatens the U.S. core interests. There is a strategic rationale for the U.S. caring about Taiwan's de facto independence, and that is, given its position right off the coast of Southeast China, it acts as a kind of bulwark against Chinese expansion and influence in the region. But first and foremost, I think there is this sense of shared values and shared commitment to democracy and a market economy that has been there for 25 years now, and is certainly endorsed by most members of Congress. And the administration, depending on who's in office, has kind of waxed and waned about how much they care about that. But certainly the broader kind of soft power that Taiwan has in the United States is first and foremost because it's a prosperous, functional liberal democracy.
But still, their strongest supporters, even during democracy, have always been the Republicans, more often the right wing of the Republican Party. Yeah. So now you have allies like John Bolton, who is ideologically light years apart from Tsai Ing-wen, for example. I mean, how can Taiwan trust a guy like him?
John Bolton is a very interesting figure. John Bolton has some fairly radical ideas about how to change the U.S.-Taiwan relationship, and it won't be John Bolton by himself making decisions about what happens next.
So what you just mentioned, the value-based relationship, that's something that Democratic Party, Obama, and so on should have valued more, but Taiwan kind of has been left out in the cold. So does Taiwan really still trust the U.S., or do they just know? I mean, they're the big guys in the room, and we need them to support us. I mean, how much pragmatism is there, and how much deeply felt connection?
Yeah. So, I mean, the United States has always been Taiwan's number one guarantor of security. It has never fully pulled back from that guarantee. And it has been by far the most committed of Taiwan's allies and partners in the region. And when you say value Taiwan's democracy, I think the Obama administration probably saw Taiwan's democracy as doing fine without a whole lot of extra help, and they could take it for granted. And so it's only when Taiwan appears to be really threatened that the U.S. actually responds to ward off those threats. And I think we are... there's a lot of sympathy today for Tsai Ing-wen in Washington, in large part because she's viewed as a very kind of moderate, steady hand on the wheel. And her efforts to strike a moderate tone in cross-strait relations have not been reciprocated by Beijing. If anything, they've kind of cracked down very, very firmly on Taiwan's diplomatic space and have tried to squeeze her. And so there's a sense in Washington, both in Congress and among key people in the administration, that Tsai Ing-wen has not gotten the kind of rewards that she should get for her behavior.
But what's the strategy here in acting tougher towards China now? I mean, China will never move an inch from its claim on Taiwan. So what's the hope here? What's the hope that's going to happen?
Well, for the United States, we have a good situation now. This is the have our cake and eat it too policy. So we have formal diplomatic relations with the PRC. We didn't have that before 1979, and we've built a very robust, multifaceted relationship with the PRC. That's taking a downward turn right now, but I think that there's still been broad mutual benefits to that relationship that weren't possible before 1979. And at the same time, we've managed to maintain this unofficial relationship with Taiwan. And so from the U.S. perspective, as long as there's a reason people talk about the status quo, as long as Taiwan remains de facto independent and democratic, the U.S. is happy with that.
And Taiwan?
Well, Taiwan's interests differ from the United States here. So at least, the majority of Taiwanese voters and the elected government of Taiwan want to expand Taiwan's diplomatic space. They want to find opportunities to strengthen Taiwan's voice in international organizations and look out for Taiwan's own independent interests. And those Particularly the more symbolic aspects of those desires do not coincide with the United States' core interests, and so the United States won't support them.
So there's a limit to how far the U.S. is going to stand up for Taiwan towards China and in general.
Yeah, and I think that limit has been there ever since 1979. There was a kind of fundamental decision that the relationship with the People's Republic of China is fundamentally more important to the United States over the long run than maintaining formal diplomatic relations with Taiwan.
So I think that a lot of people who are not so familiar with Taiwan maybe don't understand this. That means closer contacts, more military cooperation, more high-level visits, maybe more unofficial recognition. That all doesn't mean that Taiwan is moving 1 inch closer towards independence, right?
Yeah, that's correct. And Taiwan has, I believe it's 20 official diplomatic allies now. It's a very small number, and they're mostly very small countries that depend heavily on Taiwanese aid for their own survival. And yet Taiwan has very robust unofficial relationships, people-to-people exchanges, university partnerships, the business links are very strong. And so Taiwan is in this kind of virtually unique position in the world where on every metric it looks like a very successful country. It's just because of PRC pressure, most countries in the world have decided they can't officially recognize Taiwan. And most of those countries are in the same situation that the U.S. is. When it comes right down to it, the People's Republic of China has enough influence to enforce a one-China policy in those countries. And so if you want to have relations with Taiwan, it has to be done through unofficial channels.
That means realistically Taiwanese need to accept that the status quo that they have now is like as good as they're going to get.
For the foreseeable future, yes. I think that there is no way around that. It would require... the United States is not willing to go to war with China to support Taiwanese independence. Full stop. That's just an impossibility. And there were moments during the Chen Shui-bian era in particular where U.S. supporters of Taiwan got very frustrated with the Chen Shui-bian's attitudes towards independence and his insistence on kind of pushing a pro-independence agenda because it threatened U.S. core interests as well.
What's to keep the PRC from changing the framing right now and, for example, saying not recognizing 1992 consensus is akin to independence and we take that as a reason for blockade, invasion, whatever? I mean, then you would have a situation where it might lead to going to war or not.
Right. Ultimately, it's about how the U.S. side interprets that, because ultimately the U.S. is the kind of final guarantor of Taiwanese independence, de facto independence. And, if Taiwan did not do anything to provoke that shift and to provoke coercive actions by the PRC against Taiwan's their national airspace or waters, then I think the U.S. would have to respond, both because of long-standing policy and because of the signal it would send to other countries in the region. So it's in the U.S. interest to signal that to China so that we never get to that point.
Coming back to John Bolton again, so
yes.
What do you think, realistically, his appointment, if he becomes National Security Advisor, what can he change? Where could he make a mark?
Yeah. So for all practical purposes, I don't think the one China policy of the United States is likely to change anytime soon. I think there's a very clear rationale that's withstood the test of time over the last almost 40 years now. What is possible to change is the level of unofficial contacts between the United States and Taiwan. So the principal decision makers in both governments, up to and including cabinet members, could actually meet with one another. These are restrictions that the United States itself has imposed on the relationship. They're not imposed by China, and they're kind of done with an eye towards effectively appeasing China. And If it becomes, well, and I think we're at a point where it looks like China Beijing is threatening Taiwan and squeezing its space, the U.S. may kind of raise the level at which those exchanges can take place as a way to counteract that pressure and to signal that the United States does have a firm and unbreakable commitment to Taiwan's security.
And that's where someone like Bolton might maybe accelerate these developments, push for them.
Yeah, I think Bolton probably wouldn't do it by himself, but there's certainly a critical mass of people who, on the Taiwan issue, probably think a lot like he does and are much less willing to defer to China's objections on this issue, particularly in the current environment. And so official high-level exchanges is one element. The regularization or normalization of arms sales is actually, I think, a much more important element and one that is quite likely in the next 6 months to a year. The problem that Taiwan faces right now is that the U.S. is their only major arms supplier, and the U.S. has approved arms in the past on a kind of ad hoc basis, and they have actually announced those sales. They have timed the announcement of those sales to not to interrupt the U.S.-China relationship. The problem is that there's always a bad time. There's never a good time to announce these arms sales, and so the Obama administration kept delaying the announcement of an arms sale and eventually punted it over to the Trump administration. And so I think there's a critical mass of people right now who see that as kind of a failed strategy, and they want to have a regular process that every year provides Taiwan what it needs for its own security.
Last question, because this is important, but the American one-China policy never actually stated anything like Taiwan belongs to China, Taiwan is part of the one China that we recognize, etc., right?
That's correct. The American official policy on Taiwan is that Taiwan's status is undecided and that the people of Taiwan should have a say in that the ultimate resolution of that issue, that the United States recognizes that there is only one China, and that the People's Republic of China, with its capital in Beijing, is the sole representative of that government, but that Taiwan is not part of the PRC at the moment, and that it will not be part of the PRC unless the people of Taiwan themselves decide that's in their collective interest. And so, it's undecided from the U.S. perspective, and it will remain so until there is a peaceful resolution.